All right, we have a quick video here on culture and communication. I'm going to link this to another video I made for another class on multiculturalism and some of the paradoxes that come along with multiculturalism, so that we can sort of understand how and why cultures are constantly sort of in struggle with one another over values and belief systems. So a couple things that we need to know on culture. So we first want to ask ourselves, why should we study other cultures, and what other cultures do you want to learn about? First reason you want to study other cultures is because there are 7 billion people on this planet, and they all have different backgrounds, right? Those backgrounds influence their beliefs, their values, their ideas towards family and friends, how they feel about you, how you feel about them. And it's just, it's a fun tapestry to go around the world and sort of listen to other music and see different types of clothing and try different types of food. It's a fun thing to do, right? You don't want to think about, what sort of other cultures do you want to learn about, why you might be attracted to those cultures. A lot of people, they get into ancestry, DNA test, and all of a sudden they just sort of want to learn about, their own family history. You might just also just have an affinity for certain cultures that you just you read a book once, and now you're far more interested in learning about it, right? So cultures, it's a fun thing to learn about. You should try different food. You should learn different languages. I have a deeper explanation of all this again in the other video for today. So first and foremost, what is culture, right? It's a shared system of values, beliefs, worldviews, and norms. So when you have a large enough group of people and they all share these sorts of values, beliefs, worldviews, and norms, now all of a sudden you have a culture. All right. Now you can have sort of subcultures within cultures, right? Not everybody, for example, when people say like American culture, it's 300 million people. Obviously, there's different values, beliefs, worldviews, and norms amongst those individuals. So you do have various subcultures within, a larger culture like an American culture. Think about what some of the aspects of your culture are. So if we sort of take this picture of, baseball, apple pie, American flag kind of stuff, these sort of probably generally, agreed to that most Americans would just recognize as part of American culture. But again, you have various subcultures with regard to food choice and sports and games and what things people sort of coalesce around. This is a political map. I believe this is from the 2016 election as far as political differences. So again, if we're just us to take a two-party system, I know that there's third parties there, but let's just take a two-party system for a second. Obviously, Republicans and Democrats have different systems for their values, beliefs, worldviews, and norms, right? So we're all within sort of an American culture, but then people have different ways in which these policies should be enacted in order to sort of create the more perfect union, right? Now, one thing that I always think is very interesting is all these little blue areas are the highly populated areas, right? So these are the urban areas where the red is the more rural areas. And so one thing that I ask people to think about when it comes to understanding how and why there is a political divide, and obviously it's a very strong political divide in the last few years. People talk about social media, creating these sort of silos, cable news, sort of create these echo chambers where we're all just sort of very riled up for our team, and we never hear anything good about people who vote differently than us. But I also think there's something very interesting with regard to some more basic issues that are far less complicated, that don't demonize the other side as much. One of the reasons that the blue spots are very blue and the red spots are very red with regard to who votes Democrat and who votes Republican is because one of the main functions of the government as far as how it affects your day-to-day life is based on taxes. So when people say we should make government bigger, we should make government smaller, all that means is that we should give government more money to do more programs, or we should give government less money, and I'll take care of these situations on my own. All right. That's all, that's the vast majority of everything the government does, right? You give it more money, it gets bigger. You give it less money, it gets smaller. All right. And it's all about, taxes, how much money we send in the government. So this is where a lot of the debates come in. So when people say things like, we need a public option for healthcare, what that means is that you're going to send more money, you're going to send more of your tax money to the government, and they're going to sort of grow, the sort of like hospital system, but it's going to be a government, more government influence on the hospital system. If people say we need more money for infrastructure, what that means is that we're going to send more money to the government, and they're going to, build more roads. Education, we're going to, send more money to the government. They're going to, have a bigger tax base for investing in education. Things like, tuition-free college, all this other kind of stuff, right? That's the only way the government gets bigger and smaller. So one thing that I ask people to think about, especially, me, I'm out here on the East Coast, just outside of Philadelphia. It's a very blue area between like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and then out here on the West Coast, California, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Yeah, it's just very blue areas, right? And one thing that I always ask people to consider when they're these sort of like very blue areas, what's sometimes referred to as like the coastal elite. When we talk about sort of the middle of the country, all these red spots, and people are like, I don't understand all these people in rural America. Why don't they get on board with X, Y, or Z? One thing I always ask to consider is like, well, how many government programs are really going to these red areas, right? Now, obviously, things like welfare spending is available to everybody, but if we're talking about like major government overhauls for things like infrastructure, right? Why is it that somebody in rural America wants to, why is it that they feel the need to send more of their tax money to a big city to invest in more infrastructure that they themselves are never going to use? So this is a big sort of tension, specifically if we look at the state of New York. So if you look at the state of New York, which is right here, right, that I just made it all blue. Obviously, it's not all blue, but it's the state of New York. Most of the state of New York is very red outside of New York City. New York has this very interesting concept where it's like a 50-50 plan. So New York City has all the subway systems, right? 50% of the subway systems in New York, the public transportation system in New York City, is paid by people who live in New York City. And it's like, well, those are most of the people who are using the New York subway system, right? The New York public transportation system. The other 50% of the money comes from people in upstate New York, the rest of the state of New York. So the state of New York pays for 50% of New York City's infrastructure when it comes to public transportation. So I can completely empathize with people who live in upstate New York who say, look, I don't want to pay more taxes. I don't want to, let's say, support a party that's going to increase my taxes in order to pay for infrastructure in New York City when I live out in this rural community. I already put gas in the tank of my car to drive myself around. People in New York should have to pay for their own, bus rides, pay for their own subway system, their metro system, whatever, right? So there's a big divide here that's not necessarily always cultural when we talk about like the culture wars, right? These social issues, but there's something about like, people in the middle of America saying something like, why is it that I want to give the government more of my tax money when I know that the majority of that tax money is constantly going to go to these large urban areas because that's where you can grow most of the infrastructure, right? The government's not going to invest a lot of money in a public transportation system in the middle of Kansas, right? Because nobody lives there. It's never going to be used, right? But we do need a functioning infrastructure in the city of New York, right? For our subways and public transportation, they need a lot of money. But there's a lot of people who are never going to use those things. So again, like, why would they want to spend money to invest in this? I experienced something similar when I was living in Illinois. Illinois is a poorly run state when it comes to revenues and budgets. But I was living in Southern Illinois, and Illinois was going through a big financial situation when I was in Southern Illinois doing my PhD program. And they cut back on a lot of government programs, but all the government programs they cut back on were down in Southern Illinois, where not a lot of people lived. So they closed a mental health facility, they closed this like sort of like adult living community for people with disabilities. They closed a prison. So all these jobs that were, government jobs got closed down in Southern Illinois because they just weren't available that much. And all of those jobs got shipped up to Chicago, right? And they were like, we're going to open up a lot of facilities in Chicago, but they still wanted the people in Southern Illinois to pay the same amount of taxes, even though the people in Southern Illinois weren't going to get to benefit from these various programs, whether it's, opening and shutting of prisons, mental health facilities, or care facilities for adults with disabilities. So there's this huge pushback from people in Southern Illinois who are saying like, why am I paying all this money in taxes if all of the money that the government invests is just going to be shipped back up into Chicago? Same thing happened. There was a teacher strike, a Chicago public school system teacher strike in Chicago when I was living in Southern Illinois. They shut down all the schools in Chicago. They were on strike for a couple of weeks, and eventually they said, okay, we're gonna give the teachers these salary increase. But part of that salary increase had to come from state tax revenue. So a lot of people, again, in Southern Illinois outside of Chicago were saying, why is it that my taxes are going up to pay for teachers who my kids aren't benefiting from? They're like, my kids have teachers next, in my community. Why is it that my property taxes have to go up to help supplement stuff that's going on in Chicago? So this is where a lot of this sort of divide comes when it comes to rural voters versus urban voters. And this state, I mean, these blue areas, as far as the population, the blue areas and the red areas have the same population. It's just that the people in the red areas are more spread out. And again, like, this is the huge sort of divide as far as, cultural differences between the left, right, the Republicans and Democrats. Enculturation is a process about learning about one's own culture. So this is the metaphor of, a fish in water doesn't really know that it's in water because it's just around it all the time. So eventually, like, you got to get out of your culture to kind of look back in. So this is why things like traveling is so important, right? In a globalized world, like, there's something to be said about leaving, if you're from the United States, like leaving the United States for a while and kind of go get involved in another culture and practice it, and you kind of look back to the United States and you kind of learn a little bit more, learn some of the things that are different about your culture. All right, and acculturation is a process about learning about a different culture than you. In both these regards, right, how you learn is through, like, the narratives, the rituals, and then constantly reflecting. So your culture tells certain stories that other cultures don't. Your culture has certain rituals that other cultures don't. So you kind of want to study, like, how do we do school and graduation here compared to other places? How do we do marriages and childbirth here as opposed to other places? What stories are we telling, like, in our movies and our literature? And how are those stories similar or different to other cultures, right? This is something that, like, narratives is one of the things that I'm most fascinated about as far as my personal research and interest. Is I'm very interested as far as, like, how a culture creates cohesion around shared stories, right? And again, even if you don't agree with those stories. So, for example, Christmas is right around the corner now. Even if you're not a practicing Christian or Catholic, it's like there's something about this sort of Christmas story, Christmas narrative that we all create rituals around, we all participate in. Again, even if it's, not backed by any sort of faith conviction for you personally, we all still kind of know what this sort of Christmas season is all about. Not all cultures do the Christmas season, obviously. So there's something to be said about, what is it that cultures rally around? What stories do they partake in? And do they recreate and kind of keep passing along? And how are those stories different than your stories? How do you learn about different cultures? Just travel, all right? Travel, learn their stories. Okay, the other video I'm going to post gets more in depth on ethnocentrism. But long story short, ethnocentrism means that you hold your culture as sort of the standard barrier to judge other cultures. And it's more complicated than, it's just, good or bad to be ethnocentric. I run through the complications in the other video, so I'm not going to do it here as in depth. But the long and short of it is, like, there are things where, you are going to think that your culture is better than another culture in certain aspects, but you don't ever want to be ethnocentric to the point of remaining shelter, right? So you should go out there and you should learn as much as you can about every culture possible, right? But cultural norms should be debated. They have been debated, right? Cultures have changed and evolved. So this is one thing that's really difficult to get to people who want to sort of put their finger on a culture and say, like, this is my pure culture. Like, don't change it at all. It's like the culture in which you think you're putting your finger on, like, it's constantly moving and changing. So when people say something like, this is my culture, don't steal my culture, don't appropriate my culture. Problem is like that culture that you have imagined in your head has always been changing. Right? It has come into contact with other cultures, and you have both borrowed things from each other. Whether it's like whether it's food or whether it's clothing or whether it's music. It's like cultures have, like, for thousands of years, humans have come in contact with each other, and they have borrowed things from other cultures that they think would help enhance their culture. So cultural norms should be debated. Cultural norms have been debated, right? They're going to continue to be debated, right? There are ways in which you might think American culture needs to change. Well, the only way you can do that is to say, look, I think I have a better way, a more superior way for sort of organizing our society, and we have to sort of, we have to be willing to change those things. I think that, you might say, like, I think there's this other culture out in the world that does things better than the United States, and so we should look to them, right? There's also plenty of cultures out there you're saying, like, look, I think they are stuck 200-300 years in the past, and they need to sort of catch up with the rest of the world because the way in which they treat, let's say the way in which they have gender norms, like the way in which they treat women is, that's 200 years ago. Like, they need to, make sure that women have access to all the things that, women throughout the world have access to. Like, men and women should be treated equally, and there's a culture out there that's still not treating them equally. So, let's kind of catch them up. All right. So again, humans have borrowed cultural norms from each other. And the biggest thing is just stay open in conversation with lots of people in different cultures. Just because you challenge someone's cultural norms doesn't mean you're correct. All right, but you just have to go in and say, look, I'm open. Here's a topic that I'm interested in. Let's talk about gender norms in different cultures. I want to learn about it. I think my culture might have a better idea about gender norms than your culture, but we're going to be open in conversation about it. We're going to debate it. The last thing I want to talk about here is culture shock and reverse culture shock. You probably heard about this, right? So culture shock always starts with what we call the honeymoon phase. So if you're about to travel overseas, you get really excited about going overseas. I'm going to go to Spain for the first time. All right, woohoo, learn a lot of things about Spain. As soon as you get off the plane, you usually fall into anxiety because you get off the plane, you don't speak the language, you don't know what money is all about. You're like, I don't know the conversion rate. I can't, read the sign for the bathroom. Like, I don't, I got to figure out maps. Like, so you have this sort of anxious moment where you're trying to sort of figure out just the basic survival stuff, right after you get out the plane. But eventually you adjust and you're like, okay, I know how the conversion works. I know how money works. I can, read the sign for the bathroom. I know how to order food. I've learned enough of the language to get around and read the maps, and you just adjust, where you're at. And then finally there's acceptance, right? Reverse culture shock obviously is the opposite of that. So this reverse culture shock is going to have to happen after you've been in a culture for months, if not years at a time. It doesn't happen after like a 1-week vacation, right? So after you go into a new culture for a long enough period of time, right? So you're in this other culture, then you have this honeymoon phase where you get excited for going home, right? And you're like, okay, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to see my friends and family again. Then when you get home, you're like, uh-oh, I have a little bit of anxiety because people have changed. My high school friends have changed, right? My parents, have changed a little bit. Like, things aren't as like perfect as I thought they were when I graduated high school and left home for the first time, right? We have this sort of nostalgic view of our past, but then when we go there, we realize like, oh, it's just as messy as our present, right? So you start to have anxiety. But then eventually you adjust. You adjust to like, okay, I know how to be home again, and then you accept it, right? So that's what culture shock and reverse culture shock are. All right, and the final thing here, we're just going to talk about your final paper that's due in a couple of weeks. So just check it out on the syllabus. There are more instructions for this in the November 4th folder you can check out. So watch this video. The second video, I'm going to post it on multiculturalism. Read that, watch that for November 4th, and then start looking at your paper. All right. So your final paper is this, right? Pick one area of interest in the field of comm arts and science, right? This needs to be something different than you're going to cover in what we call the small group book report presentation, which we'll get to in a week or so. Don't worry about that yet. But you need to pick a topic, one topic, one. All right. People try to cover 5 or 6. Just pick one. All right. You're only writing a 4 to 5 page paper. Look through the table of contents of your textbook or go through all the different PowerPoint slides or the videos we've watched. Okay, pick one area of interest. For example, we've talked about verbal, nonverbal, public speaking, persuasion, interpersonal, culture today. OrComm we'll get to, small group we'll get to, and HealthComm we'll get to. Pick one of these sort of fields within comm arts and science that you want to write a 4 to 5 page paper on that summarizes the key ideas of the field, right? What are the main ideas? Who are the important scholars? You should know if, studying, for instance, this is an example, if you want to do something on interpersonal communication. Need 3 scholarly sources. Your textbook does not count as a source, so go find some academic journal articles. Go find primary sources via the library, and the library has plenty on all of these topics. All right, no internet sources, the end. Your essay should be in 3 parts. The first part, introduction, a clear thesis and preview your essay, okay? So here's a good thesis statement. The purpose of this paper is to inform you about interpersonal communication. Done, right? Then you write a 4-page paper on interpersonal communication, right? The body, summarize the field using your 3 scholarly sources. So tell me what are important ideas about interpersonal communication, who are some important scholars. Summarize that in 4 to 5 pages. Your conclusion, all right? And these instructions are located online because I know that my face is blocking some of them, right? But you just want to kind of critique the field and the class, right? So stay focused on your topic, right? What should be the future of comm arts and science? What jobs can you, I can't even read this. What jobs can it be helpful with? All right, so after you've studied interpersonal communication, what sort of, you could say, like, you go into counseling, right? You could do some sort of like one-on-one HR work. So what is going to be of it if you want to do intercultural communication? Okay, like, doing stuff abroad, right, would be of interest to you. Working with people who come to the United States from different cultures, right, would be something that's interested you, right? What should it teach more so students are prepared for careers as far as the class is concerned? What are the pros and cons of the class? What did the class do well? That way I can, keep doing it in the future. What do I need to improve on? Okay, so this is the conclusion aspect of your paper. All right, write a 4 to 5 page paper. Pick one aspect of the many topics we've discussed. 3 scholarly sources that summarize that aspect of comm arts and science, and then just in the conclusion, talk about what this field can do in order to sort of, perpetuate you forward in your careers. All right, that's all I have for this first day on culture. Make sure you watch that other video that I'll post down below, but I'll also send it out in an email. All right, see you later.